The Earth was a restless giant, breathing clouds of dust and fire beneath a wide and indifferent sky. Volcanoes coughed into the horizon, rivers carved new scars through the bones of mountains, and vast plains shimmered under the weight of ancient suns. It was a world raw and untamed, where no cities yet stood, no words were spoken, and no history was written, only lived. Among the rustling grasslands and shadowed forests of Africa, millions of years before the first spark of civilization, the early humans, fragile, curious, and determined, were learning to exist. These were not yet Homo sapiens, but their forebears, beings who walked upright, gazed across the plains, and began to see themselves as something apart from the beasts. Their world was harsh and merciless. Every sunrise was a gamble with death, every night, a struggle against the cold, the dark, and the eyes that glowed in the tall grass. Imagine the air thick with the scent of wet soil and rotting fruit, the calls of strange creatures echoing in the distance. Herds of enormous beasts, giant elephants with curving tusks, saber-toothed cats stalking the herds, flightless birds towering over the brush moved like living storms. To survive here required more than muscle, it required memory, cooperation, and the beginnings of thought. Our ancestors, scattered in small bands across the African plains, watched, learned, and adapted. They carried no weapons but stones, no homes but caves, no protection but one another. Yet in their gaze was something dangerous, the spark of curiosity. They began to understand that the world could be shaped, not merely endured. In those days, survival meant endless motion. Waterholes dried up under merciless suns, forcing groups to wander in search of life. When the rains came, they came like gods, flooding valleys, washing away all but the strongest. Food was never guaranteed. The men and women foraged for berries, roots, and carcasses left by lions. When they found the remains of a kill, they would crouch together, cracking bones with sharp stones to reach the rich marrow inside. The taste of survival was metallic and primal, and it carried with it the ancient knowledge that life fed upon life. They learned to read the world like a silent language, the direction of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the smell of blood. Every sense was sharpened to a blade's edge, for one mistake could mean extinction. The nights were the hardest. Fire was not yet mastered. They relied only on warmth from huddled bodies and the safety of numbers. The darkness seemed alive, filled with whispers, growls, and the rustle of unseen predators circling the edges of camp. Eyes glowed in the black, watching. Mothers clutched their young close, the men gripped stones and waited for the dawn. Sometimes the screams of prey, antelope, monkey, or even one of their own, tore through the night air, reminding them that they were not yet the masters of the world. They were a fragile experiment in evolution, balanced between triumph and annihilation. But even in this fragile existence, something profound stirred. The mothers began to teach the shape of a berry that would not kill, the path to a hidden spring, the cry of a predator before it strikes. Knowledge began to pass from one generation to the next, not by instinct, but by memory. They began to mimic sounds, gestures, the rhythms of communication that would one day become language. Each lesson learned was a step away from the abyss. Around simple shelters of branches and stone, they gathered, sharing warmth, food, and the comfort of presence. These small fires of community, though without flame, burned bright in spirit. Cooperation became their greatest weapon. Alone, they were prey. Together, they were possibility. Seasons shifted, and so did they. Across plains of gold and through forests dense with mystery, they moved with the migrations of beasts. Every journey carried risk, crossing rivers swollen by rain, entering territories of predators, facing rival bands. Yet with each danger survived, their resilience deepened. They began to see patterns, the movement of stars, the timing of herds, the return of rains. Memory became map, instinct became intention. Slowly, the random chaos of nature began to take form in their minds. The first seeds of understanding, the earliest thoughts that would one day bloom into science and art, were planted in those silent, wondering gazes. One might look at them and see only animals, but beneath the grime and scars, humanity was awakening. The mothers' lullabies, wordless hums to soothe their children, were the first music. The laughter of discovery when a stone broke into a sharper edge was the first invention. The gaze between two hunters who shared the same thought, the first glimpse of empathy. In their bones lay the blueprint of every dream, every story, every civilization yet to come. They were not yet aware of their destiny, but the universe had already chosen them to be its storytellers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the savannah in crimson light, one figure stood apart. A young male, lean and wary, his eyes followed a bird soaring high above. He did not yet know what flight meant, but something within him stirred a longing to rise above fear, to reach beyond survival. In that silent yearning lay the seed of the future. The earth around him was ancient and wild, but the mind within him was new, untested, and boundless. He picked up a stone, turned it in his hand, and for the first time, struck it with purpose. The spark that leapt from that blow was not yet fire, but it was something just as powerful, intention. And in that moment, the story of humanity truly began. Ages passed like whispers in the wind. The world shifted, reshaped by time and the slow heartbeat of the earth. Forests receded, giving way to open plains that rolled endlessly beneath the sun. Rivers carved new paths, and herds thundered across the land in ancient migrations. The early humans, no longer just wanderers, began to carve their place in this vast theater of life. Their hands, once clumsy and uncertain, now sought purpose. The stone that once cracked by chance was now struck with thought. From these crude blows came edges sharp enough to slice meat, to scrape hides, to carve bone. The Stone Age had begun not as a single moment, but as a dawning awareness that the world could be shaped by will. Each day was a lesson written in sweat, blood, and silence. The people observed how stones fractured, how one shape cut better than another, how a strike angled just so could yield a perfect edge. Around their makeshift camps, shards glittered like stars scattered on the ground. The first tools were simple hand axes, scrapers, and flakes, but they changed everything. Where once they scavenged from predators' kills, now they became hunters in their own right. Spears of sharpened wood, tipped with stone, gave them distance and power. The chase began to tilt in their favor. They learned to move as one, reading each other's motions, predicting the flight of prey. Coordination became instinct, trust became survival. In these hunts lay the first echoes of leadership, strategy, and unity, the raw framework of future civilization. Fire came not as a miracle, but as discovery. Perhaps lightning struck a tree, and one brave soul dared to approach the smoking remains. At first, it was terror, the light that burned and consumed. But curiosity, ever the engine of human evolution, drew them closer. They learned that fire could be tamed, that it obeyed the hand that fed it. When they carried burning branches to their caves, the darkness retreated for the first time in history. Predators stayed away, and warmth spread through their bodies like memory itself. The fire changed them in ways beyond survival. It brought gathering, storytelling, connection. Around its flickering glow, they learned to see each other not just as bodies, but as minds. The night became a time of reflection, not fear. Shadows danced on cave walls, and perhaps in those shapes, imagination was born. The mastery of fire was more than warmth, it was transformation. Meat roasted over flames gave strength, smoke preserved food for the journeys ahead. The taste of cooked flesh was unlike anything before, tender, sustaining, divine. It freed time and energy once spent on endless foraging. They could travel farther, stay awake longer, think deeper. And from those long nights of flame and whisper, the roots of language began to take hold. Gestures evolved into sounds, sounds into patterns. Mothers called to children, hunters signaled danger, elders taught by voice. The first words were not poetry, they were survival, but they carried power nonetheless. With language, knowledge could endure beyond one life. Ideas could travel across generations, outlasting the bodies that birthed them. Humanity had discovered immortality through memory. As generations passed, the small bands grew in number and skill. They began to leave marks, paintings on stone, carvings in bone, footprints hardened in mud. Each symbol was a fragment of thought preserved in time. Some scholars would one day call it art. For them, it was expression, an attempt to hold meaning in a world of uncertainty. They painted animals they hunted, the rivers they followed, and shapes whose meaning we may never fully grasp. These were the first attempts to understand the unseen, to give form to belief. The idea that life had rhythm, that events followed patterns, began to take shape. The stars above, once distant and silent, became guides. The early humans learned the language of constellations, seasons, and cycles. The Earth was not just a place they lived in, it was a living story, and they were its authors. With progress came new struggles. Competition for land and food grew fierce. Other tribes appeared, similar yet strange, with different faces, tools, and tongues. The first conflicts were not wars of conquest, but of survival. A shared watering hole, a hunting ground, a cave, these could mean life or death. Yet even in conflict, something deeply human emerged: empathy. They began to bury their dead, covering bodies with flowers or red ochre, as if to say that even in death, there was meaning. They mourned, they remembered. No other creature on earth did this. In that act of grief lay the birth of spirit, the first glimpse of belief in something beyond flesh. The fire burned, the tools sharpened, and thought deepened. Around the world, humanity spread north toward the colder lands, east through dense forests, west across rivers and mountains. They faced new climates, new beasts, new trials. The Ice Age loomed, and the world grew crueler. Yet they adapted, wrapping themselves in furs, building shelters of bone and hide, learning to store food and share warmth. Cooperation became law. The weak survived through the strength of the group, and the strong learned compassion through the needs of the weak. Through hardship, humanity evolved not just in body, but in soul. At night, under endless skies, the firelight flickered on faces filled with wonder. Perhaps a child stared into the flames, seeing shapes that were not there, dreaming of things that had never existed. The mind, now awakened, began to imagine. Dreaming was no longer just instinct, it became creation. They dreamed of hunts, of spirits, of tomorrow. And in those dreams, humanity began to invent the future. Firelight painted their faces gold, and for the first time, they were not simply surviving the world, they were shaping it. As dawn came, the tribe stirred. Smoke rose gently into the pale morning air. A hunter sharpened his spear. A mother tied a strip of hide around her child's waist. Above them, vultures circled, and in the distance, mammoths moved like living mountains across the frost-touched plain. Life was still perilous, but no longer hopeless. The flame had given them mastery over darkness, the stone had given them power over flesh, and thought had given them dominion over chance. They were still small creatures beneath a vast sky, but something within them burned brighter than any fire, the unstoppable will to endure, to understand, and to become more. The world turned colder. The sun dimmed behind veils of grey, and winter became not a season but an age. The ice stretched across continents, swallowing valleys and forests, sculpting mountains with its slow, merciless hands. Herds of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and steppe bison roamed beneath skies heavy with snow. The breath of every creature turned to mist, every movement a struggle against the cold. For the early humans, life became a relentless test of endurance. The plains that once shimmered with heat were now oceans of frost. Water froze in their skins, food grew scarce, and death stalked not just from predators, but from the very air they breathed. Yet within this frozen crucible, humanity did not vanish. It adapted, endured, and evolved. They built shelters now no longer just caves but homes of bone and hide, lashed together with sinew and sealed with clay. The mammoth, both hunter and provider, became the cornerstone of survival. Its meat fed the tribe for weeks, its bones formed the frames of their dwellings, its tusks were carved into tools, ornaments, and symbols of strength. Around flickering fires, families huddled close, sharing warmth through body and story. Firelight revealed the faces of mothers, fathers, children, no longer just individuals, but kin bound by shared struggle. They were learning that unity was strength. Through the storm, they began to sense a deeper bond than hunger or fear, the bond of belonging. The cold forged not only stronger bodies but sharper minds. They learned to plan hunts across miles of frozen plains, tracking herds through patterns in the snow. They fashioned spears tipped with stone and bone, threw them with power and accuracy. They made clothing of layered furs, stitched with bone needles and sinew thread. Their fingers, once clumsy, now created tools so refined that even time would hesitate to erase them. But beyond craft, something more profound was forming: cooperation beyond blood. Tribes began to meet and trade, flint for amber, hides for shells, words for friendship. Around shared fires, they exchanged stories, laughter, and songs. From this web of connection grew the roots of society. Language deepened. What began as simple calls for danger or direction evolved into rhythm and structure. Words began to hold ideas, emotions, promises. An elder could tell a child not only what was, but what could be. For the first time, the past could be remembered and the future imagined. They named things, animals, places, even one another, and with names came identity. The tribe became more than a group, it became a people. The telling of stories became a sacred act, a way of preserving memory when bodies failed. Around every fire, stories rose like smoke into the cold night. Tales of brave hunts, of lost kin, of spirits that lived in wind and stone. In those stories lay the seed of myth, the birth of culture, and the first understanding that life was more than survival, it was meaning. As the Ice Age deepened, migration began. The tribes followed the herds and the thaw, walking across new lands that would one day be called Europe, Asia, and beyond. Some crossed frozen seas, unaware they were entering new worlds. Their footprints pressed into snow that no one had ever touched before. The journey was perilous, children lost to the cold, hunters taken by beasts, entire clans swallowed by avalanches. Yet they kept moving. Something within them refused to yield. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps only instinct, but in that relentless forward motion was destiny itself. Every step carried humanity farther from extinction and closer to transformation. In those endless migrations, they encountered others, not beasts, but beings like themselves, though different. Some were taller, some broader, with faces unfamiliar. The Neanderthals ruled the colder lands, powerful and wise in their own ways. The meetings were tense at first, competition for prey, water, shelter, but also curiosity. In some places, they fought, in others, they shared. Over time, their worlds intertwined. They traded, they learned, and even mingled blood. Humanity was not a single flame but 1,000 sparks scattered across the earth, each adapting to its own corner of the world. The great tapestry of evolution was being woven by struggle, encounter, and exchange. The bond of kinship grew stronger as the climate tested them. Birth and death became sacred. When a child was born, the tribe rejoiced as if the earth itself had given them a promise. When someone died, their body was buried with care, tools, beads, perhaps a lock of hair. They believed, though they could not yet speak it, that life did not end in the cold ground. The first rituals began, simple gestures of reverence that echoed through generations. Fire became holy, water, cleansing. The act of survival was no longer just physical but spiritual. They began to feel gratitude for the hunt, remorse for the kill, awe for the storm. In those emotions lay the roots of morality, the quiet voice that whispered, "We belong to something greater than ourselves." As time crawled on, their creativity bloomed. In the shelter of caves, they painted visions of their world, bison charging, hands reaching, stars swirling in ochre and charcoal. Each stroke was a bridge between flesh and dream, a message to the future carved in color and stone. They were saying, "We were here." The act of painting was not mere decoration, it was communion. Perhaps they believed the images gave them power over the beasts they hunted, or perhaps they painted out of wonder, out of the need to remember. Whatever the reason, those walls became mirrors of the human soul, shining through time. And in this frozen, glittering world, love was born not just as instinct, but as emotion. A mother's gentle hum to her child, a hunter's silent grief for his fallen companion, the laughter shared between two souls who survived another winter, all were signs of a growing inner life. They began to hold hands not just for warmth but for comfort. They began to dream not just of food and fire, but of tomorrow. Beneath the ice, the heart of humanity beat steadily, refusing to freeze. At last, the ice began to retreat. Rivers broke free, forests returned, and the air softened with the scent of green. Generations had passed since the first fires burned, but the spirit remained unchanged. They had endured hunger, cold, and extinction itself, and yet they lived. From the frost and flame of those ages rose something eternal, the human will to belong, to create, to remember. The world was thawing, and so were they. The dawn of new life awaited, and the path of evolution stretched onward toward villages, tools of bronze, and stories yet unwritten. But for now, they stood at the edge of the melt, faces lifted to the warming sun, their breath mingling with the mist, their eyes filled with wonder. The long ice had shaped them, but kinship had saved them. The thaw came slowly, as if the earth itself were waking from a long, dreamless sleep. Ice rivers melted into rushing streams, plains once buried beneath frost now blushed with green. The air was heavy with the scent of new rain, and life surged again, birds filled the skies, herds returned to graze, and the forests thickened with promise. The people, who had spent generations chasing the horizon, began to stop. For the first time in history, the earth offered stability. The endless wandering that had defined their existence gave way to a new rhythm, the rhythm of staying. This shift, from hunter to settler, was not sudden. It was slow, uncertain, filled with trial and revelation. But once begun, it could not be undone. Humanity was stepping out of the age of survival and into the age of creation. They began to notice patterns in the world around them. Seeds fell, sprouted, and grew where they landed. A woman, gathering roots near her shelter, saw young shoots rising where she had discarded scraps months before. The realization was quiet, almost accidental, yet world-changing. Life could be cultivated. They began to sow deliberately, first small patches, then larger clearings near rivers and valleys. Grains like barley and wheat, once wild and unpredictable, became the first crops. For the first time, food did not depend solely on the chase. This mastery over plants was not just discovery, it was revolution. The hunters were becoming farmers, and with that, time itself began to change. Seasons were no longer only threats, they became guides. The earth's cycles, once feared, were now understood. Humanity had found its first partnership with soil. The old skills were not forgotten. The hunters still roamed, tracking deer and boar with precision honed through centuries of survival. But now, the rhythm of life included tending, waiting, planning. Women gathered seeds, men cleared brush, and children learned to dig and water. Fire was used not just for warmth, but to clear fields and shape clay into vessels. The first pots, hardened by flame, held grain, water, and stories. Around them, homes rose, no longer temporary shelters but lasting sanctuaries. Walls of mud, thatch, and stone marked the beginnings of architecture. The people began to see the land not just as a place to survive, but as a home. The first villages were born along fertile rivers, the Tigris, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, cradles of humanity's next great leap. With settlement came abundance, and with abundance came complexity. Food stored for the future allowed more time for thought, for art, for invention. The tribe became a community. The community became a society. Roles began to form, some tended fields, others crafted tools, others watched the skies. The stars that had once been guides for migration now became calendars. Patterns of light told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for rain. They built shrines to the sun, the moon, and the river, honoring the forces that sustained them. The first gods were born from gratitude and fear, a reflection of nature's unpredictable generosity. Each ritual, each offering, carried the weight of awe and the whisper of understanding. The people began to believe that life itself had a spirit, and that spirit could be honored, perhaps even persuaded. But peace was not permanent. With wealth came envy. Food, once shared freely among the hungry, became power. Those who controlled the granaries and fields began to wield authority. Hierarchies emerged, fragile yet undeniable. Some took on the role of leaders, others of guardians, still others of laborers. The concept of ownership, alien to the old hunter's life, took root like an invasive seed. Boundaries were drawn, disputes rose, and for the first time, humans fought not only for survival, but for possession. The simplicity of the old world began to fade, replaced by the complexity of human ambition. Yet even in conflict, growth continued. They built fences, dug irrigation channels, and shaped the land with intention. Civilization, in its earliest form, was taking shape through the same dual forces that had always driven humanity, necessity and desire. As generations passed, their tools grew more refined. Stone gave way to bronze, and bronze to invention. The wheel, the loom, the plough, each new creation amplified their strength. No longer bound by nature's mercy, they began to mold nature itself. Rivers were redirected, mountains cut for stone, forests cleared for fields. Humanity had become a force of transformation. But this power carried a quiet cost. The distance between man and wilderness grew. The songs once sung to the stars now echoed within the walls of settlements. The simplicity of the hunt gave way to the complexity of trade, governance, and belief. Yet in their hearts, the memory of their ancestors remained a whisper of wind across the plains, a flicker of fire in the night, reminding them of where they had begun. Within the villages, culture flourished. Pottery became art, not merely function. Walls bore carvings of gods and beasts, each telling a story of struggle and triumph. Music emerged, rhythms beaten on drums of stretched hide, flutes carved from bone. Dance became ritual, connecting body and earth in celebration of life. The people learned to weave not only baskets and cloth but ideas, stories of creation, of heroes, of the unseen world beyond. The elders taught the young not only how to live, but why. Knowledge passed through words, through song, through symbol. History was being born, one story at a time. And with thought came reflection. Humanity began to question not just how to survive, but what it meant to exist. They watched the stars and saw patterns that mirrored their own lives: birth, growth, death, renewal. The sky became a mirror for the mind. The first philosophers were not scholars in robes, but farmers gazing upward, hunters resting after a long day, mothers whispering lullabies to sleeping children. They wondered where the sun went at night, why the seasons turned, what waited beyond the horizon. Curiosity, that ancient spark born in the mind of the first toolmaker, had never dimmed, it had simply evolved. By the time the rivers flooded again, turning fields to mirrors of sky, humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. No longer at the mercy of nature, they had become its partners, and sometimes its masters. Villages hummed with the sounds of life, children laughing, tools clinking, fires crackling. The tribe had become a people, and the people were becoming a civilization. They stood now at the edge of a new dawn, unaware that their small experiments in cultivation and cooperation would one day build empires, cities, and nations. But in that moment, in the gentle warmth of the post-Ice Age sun, they had achieved something miraculous. They had learned not just how to survive, but how to live. The age of wilderness was fading, and a new era was rising, one built not from bone and flame, but from imagination. Across fertile valleys and shining rivers, humanity gathered in numbers that would have once seemed impossible. The hunters had become farmers, the wanderers had become builders, and the storytellers had become dreamers of worlds. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. Mud walls turned to stone, and huts became temples. For the first time, the horizon was marked not by mountains or trees, but by the work of human hands. Humanity, once at the mercy of nature, now shaped it with confidence and creativity. But even as their tools grew sharper and their dwellings grander, the spirit that had guided them through ice, storm, and hunger still burned in every heart, the eternal desire to endure, to understand, to create. Life, though changed, remained a struggle. Floods could destroy crops, droughts could starve whole communities, and disease could strike without mercy. Yet unlike their ancestors, these people did not scatter or flee. They stayed. They rebuilt. They adapted. The lessons of countless generations, the fire's warmth, the hunt's patience, the shelter's strength, were now woven into their way of life. The same resilience that had carried them through the freezing plains now built walls, stored grain, and planned for seasons yet to come. The wisdom of survival had evolved into the wisdom of civilization. Humanity was learning not only to conquer nature but to coexist with it, to bend without breaking, to plan beyond the moment, to live with intention. Language had blossomed into a miracle. No longer a handful of sounds and gestures, it became poetry, song, lore, and story. Through words, They preserved what memory could not. The stories of creation, of gods and heroes, of floods and fire, these tales bound them together, uniting hundreds of minds into one shared vision. In each story was a fragment of truth, a memory of their ancestors' long march through chaos. The myths of the sun god, the river goddess, the spirits of earth and sky, each was a reflection of the world they had once feared and now sought to understand. Words became the scaffolding of thought, allowing humanity to reach beyond instinct and dream of eternity. In their tongues lay the architecture of the soul. Art flourished alongside language. The paintings that once decorated cave walls evolved into sculpture, pottery, and design. Hands that had once grasped spears now carved stone and molded clay with purpose. Each stroke, each symbol, was a declaration of existence. We were here. We mattered. They built monuments not only to gods, but to memory, to ancestors, to victories, to the passage of time. The rhythm of drums echoed across the valleys, flutes sang to the wind, and dancers moved like the rivers that had birthed their world. Art was no longer just imitation of life, it was celebration, reflection, and prophecy. Through art, they reached for immortality, for something beyond flesh and bone. Trade became the lifeblood of connection. Where once tribes met in wary silence, now caravans crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. They exchanged not only goods but ideas, new tools, new songs, new gods. The world was growing smaller, even as imagination grew vast. From the Middle Eastern plains to the African savannas, from the river valleys of China to the forests of Europe, humanity's shared story began to weave itself into one great tapestry. The spark that had been struck by the first toolmaker now blazed across continents. Each people carried a fragment of the same ancient flame, the same unquenchable hunger to learn, to build, to become. But with growth came contradiction. Power brought conflict, abundance brought greed. The simplicity of the old ways faded under the weight of hierarchy and ambition. Kings rose, priests ruled, armies marched. Stone walls separated rich from poor, sacred from profane. The first civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, and others emerged as both triumphs and warnings. Humanity had mastered its environment, but could it master itself? The same fire that once kept the darkness at bay now threatened to consume. Yet even in war and turmoil, progress did not stop. Each conflict, each loss, forged new understanding of justice, of compassion, of the fragile balance between creation and destruction. The struggle had simply changed its shape. Still, through every hardship, the human spirit endured. The child's laughter by the riverbank, the mother's song beside the hearth, the elder's story beneath the stars, these remained unchanged from the time of the first fire. The heart of humanity was not found in temples or kings, but in these quiet moments of connection. In the shared gaze between parent and child lay the same promise that had guided their ancestors through the Ice Age, that life, fragile as it was, would continue. Love had become their greatest invention, stronger than any tool, wiser than any law. It bound them together, across tribes, across generations, across time itself. As centuries turned to millennia, the echoes of the prehistoric world still lingered. The instincts of the hunter lived on in the builder's precision, the explorer's courage, the artist's passion. Every invention, every discovery, every civilization was a continuation of that first awakening beneath the African sun. The story of humanity was not a straight line, but a spiral ever rising, yet forever rooted in the same soil of struggle and wonder. The flame lit by that first spark of curiosity had never gone out, it had only grown brighter, branching into every mind that dared to dream. Now, when we look back through fossils, bones, and fragments of painted stone, we are not merely studying our ancestors. We are gazing into a mirror. Their fears were our fears, their hopes, our hopes. The hands that once shaped flint now build skyscrapers, the voices that once called through the forest now send words across the stars. Yet at our core, we are still them, the wanderers, the seekers, the storytellers. The ones who refused to die in the dark. The ones who built warmth from nothing but stone and faith. The ones who looked at the night sky and asked, what lies beyond? And so, the story that began with a spark in the hands of a trembling ancestor continues still. Every heartbeat, every breath, Every dream is a verse in the same eternal song, the song of survival, of evolution, of human spirit. From the caves of prehistory to the cities of glass and steel, one truth endures. We are the children of resilience, born from struggle, forged by fire, and guided by the endless curiosity that makes us human. The world around us may have changed beyond recognition, but the flame within, the same one lit millions of years ago, still burns bright, carrying the promise of every dawn to come.